Welcome to the Thriving Children podcast, the show that helps parents and teachers to put the magic back in child development. Here's your host, Clare Crew.
This is episode 69 of the Thriving Children podcast. I'm Clare Crew, and today I'm chatting with Rebecca Thompson from Stone and Sprocket. Welcome, Beck.
Hi, Claire. Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome. Now, today we're going to be talking about Schema, what it is, and how we can apply this idea, this understanding to children's play and behaviour. But firstly, I really want to hear a little bit about your journey as an early childhood educator, because it seems as though, as you said before we started recording, that we've lived parallel professional lives. It'd be great if you could share that with us.
Yes, Claire, I thought it was quite amazing when you and I started to have a conversation, and then I had a little bit of a read about you on your website. And yes, it does seem as though we've been living parallel professional lives. I guess you could say that sometimes when you and I have spoken about the idea of us seeking answers constantly and being that sort of professional personality, I think sometimes I create more questions about my practice than seek answers, but I've always had a reflective nature, and I've always been involved in teaching in some capacity, right down to very similar to you, organising my friends and cousins into rows as a child and ticking off their work. I also did work experience in preschools in year 10 and schools, and my study journey began as a Certificate 3. Then Certificate 4 and a diploma, and I completed an undergrad Bachelor of Education, which sort of started my path on the early intervention, additional needs journey of my professional life, because I had a lot to do with the early intervention service that was connected to the university I was studying at. And I always chose the additional needs, or special needs we used to call it in those days, subjects. And I just, I suppose when I started working at the early intervention service as well as a key educator, and also supporting children in preschools, I started to sort of focus very closely on the child and how I can develop goals for them to be integrated into mainstream settings. And it wasn't until I branched further out into a master's degree in inclusive education that I learnt more about the idea of inclusion, as opposed to just simply integration or support, and the impact that curriculum choices and environments have on children's behaviour. So my thinking has shifted over the last 5 years, and there are a couple of other milestones that have created more questions for me rather than answers in the last 4 or 5 years, and one of those being that I've had my own children. I've got 2 boys, one who is nearly 4 and one who is nearly 11 months. And I've just really enjoyed stepping back and seeing how valuable it is to their development by stepping back, I suppose, and just letting things happen and creating those enabling environments. And the second milestone that has created more questions and reflections for me is the work that I have been doing with Clare in nature pedagogy. This lens has really drawn my focus to a rights-based approach, where I'm consistently challenging educators that I visit now in services through my business in Stone and Sprocket to ask themselves who does their decision serve in terms of curriculum, and it's often challenging behaviours that I get invited to come and talk about and model and coach in. And I'm just now taking that focus off the child more and more and looking at the environments that support children's learning.
Yeah, the impact of the environment is a huge one. And something else that I loved from what you shared there, Beck, with your journey is just the fact that it's constantly evolving and you're still not at an end point now. Likewise with me, it's just going to constantly, as you said, we're going to keep on asking more and more questions and I guess stepping up as an educator and in our work in guiding others, which is pretty exciting. So on to schema. It's a very fancy word. What does it actually mean?
Yes, so schema is something that I first heard about when I was doing my diploma as an educator, as a beginning educator. I was working in a 2 to 3 room, and I saw this pop up in my studies when we were learning about Jean Piaget, and in those days we looked at things very deeply, and I learnt about this idea of a developmental lens and how children organise knowledge, but I kind of ignored it then and just focused really on what Piaget had to offer through his stages of development. However, the idea that that Piaget was describing repeated patterns of play, I never really applied it fully until I started to notice that services were wanting to step back more and watch children's, watch their just their innate needs to repeat their play activities. So schema is a term coined by Jean Piaget, and it's basically the repeated actions that children engage in as a way of organising their knowledge. So it's about the cognitive, and Piaget believed that children have existing schema and knowledge, but when new information is presented, the children have a need to either somehow organise this information, so they need to either assimilate it or accommodate it, and they're all very big jargony words. So I suppose, for example, some of the classic ones that we might see is if a child rolls a small ball down a large cardboard chute, which is often something we see in 2 to 3 rooms or even infant rooms, or we can even see this sort of thing in preschool environments on a larger scale. But they might repeat this in order to test out this new idea. So they need to keep on doing it to really embed it in their brain. And then if they can't quite assimilate that, then a new schema needs to be created. So you might then see children testing out a wooden block or even using a big ball to roll down the chute that might not fit, and they're constantly changing, testing new ideas out in different ways. There are many types of schema, so that particular one could be simply just children wanting to see the vertical lines of trajectory. But there are other ones. For example, there are the times where you might see the children take everything from your home corner, put it into a big blanket or a bag and transport it all the way over to the other side of the room, or even those times where you see the sand taken from the sand pit all the way over to the other side of the yard repeatedly. There are also, various ones that can happen at various times, positioning, lining up objects, and there are hundreds of different types of schema, and they're fascinating to watch.
And so I'm guessing that when a child is drawn to, repeating one of these patterns or experimenting, it's something that needs to just unfold. So it's something that we need to just be watching and supporting. Is that your approach to it, Beck?
Absolutely, and I think, look, this Piaget has presented this theory, and I suppose now for early childhood in particular, this can happen in primary as well in terms of learning to read and write. But if we're talking early childhood in particular, there have been some people that have tested out this theory now. Kathy Nutt-Brown and Frances Atherton and Chris Athey have now spoken about schematic pedagogy. So we look at it now, pedagogy being how we teach and what we teach. So if we see schema as a consideration for what we teach and how we teach, or schematic pedagogy, that means that we're focusing on that deep observation in order to understand the structure of children's thinking. So that it means that we do need to sit back and simply watch, and we also need to have the child's right to follow these urges at the forefront of our decision making. So often we feel the urge to jump in and show the child how something should be done if they're struggling, or we might even feel the urge to jump in because we're excited to be part of the play. And it is difficult to step back and watch, but also magical when you learn the skill.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. It's worth developing. So can you think of maybe one or two examples of a certain behaviour that a child has done in your time doing this work that's been problematic or maybe hasn't really been understood or valued, and how that actually relates to schema? So what that child was actually gaining from that experience or from that behaviour?
So generally, if I go to visit children in services and I'm looking for the function of their behaviour, so the reasons as to why they might be doing something that is not desirable, schema is something that is one small facet of a big pie of considerations. And an example that I could use in terms of the time where I thought it could be schema is there was a child who consistently would stand up on the tables and jump off, and no matter where this child was, he would be finding some sort of level to get to a higher place, and he would just continually climb up and jump, and the teachers were getting frustrated by this. They thought it was okay for him to do this outside, but it became a little bit of an issue inside, and so I just spoke to them about the idea of schema and could we watch exactly what it is that he is doing and why he's doing it, and we sort of set up some different levels for him, and he began to do this, but the biggest question for us was, do we tell him that he can't do this inside and that he needs to save his urges for outside? Or could we actually nourish this schema, this urge to repeatedly jump, through other ways to reduce that particular need to jump? And at the time, I didn't realise that this particular schema is trajectory. So trajectory is sometimes seen through throwing, but it can also be seen through jumping, and it's the children wanting to see vertical lines. So I diverted the child to other ways of jumping that was safer, with pillows and things inside. But now in hindsight, which is always a wonderful thing, I think if this happened again, I would talk to people about really using the language of lines, so up and down, and also guiding your finger in the air up and down, having lots of open-ended materials around the room indoors that you can create vertical lines with, like bits of string and long blocks and things like that, so that visual of that vertical line can be nourished for the child. And I suppose this is a really nice little connection to, and this is sort of the philosophy behind my business, Stone and Sprocket, is that the idea of schematic pedagogy aligns itself nicely with the idea of open-ended materials and the loose parts theory as well.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I like as well, I mean, you talked at the start about how you've always been one to do that reflective practice, and I can even see evidence of it in what you just said, that, if you had your time over again in that site with that specific student, or specific child, there is a slightly different approach that you would take. And I'm often exactly the same. I guess what you can do, what you can offer, or what you can suggest to help is going to be different with the families I'm working with now versus the families that I worked with 5 years ago. So it's great that you're noticing those changes within yourself and your philosophy. And I guess as well, part of that is because you're continuing to learn, and you're, going in deep with nature play and things with Clare Warden, which I'm guessing would be part of that complementary approach and understanding of child development too. So Beck, perhaps you can share some more examples of schema at work.
So it's always in hindsight for me, Claire. I'll give you another hindsight one. And then I do have one that I've been watching more recently, which is really exciting. But one that happened to me, which I didn't realise many years ago, was the ones that drive us all crazy. And this one was where I liked my benches at preschool to be very tidy, and my lovely little displays on top of the teacher's bench. Which, I probably wouldn't have that at the moment now, thinking about, ownership in the room and what we do with children as opposed to to children. But I did have a bench that I liked to be mine, where I had all different displays and things, information for parents. And every day there was a child who would grab their favourite truck and plonk the truck, up high along this bench and push it along, watching the truck drive along, and all of my beautiful displays would be plop, 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 all the way down off the bench every single day, every morning that this child came. And I really didn't take much notice of it until this happened over and over. And I said to the person I was working with, look, this is driving me crazy. I keep putting these things back up on the bench and he just keeps knocking them down, and I don't know why. And the person I was working with suggested that it was because he just liked to watch the wheels go around, which quite possibly it could have been. We do sometimes see schema double over with those ideas of sensory seeking. So it could have been that visual of the wheels going around, or things like that for a child. But I think, thinking back, that sometimes when I look at functions of behaviour, if it is not a sensory issue, and we have ruled that out through our process of elimination, I think sometimes schema really does have a place in the function of behaviour, the reasons as to why a child might be doing something. They may innately need to be consistently doing this just to organise this information. And there is a schema called orientation, where children need to change the position of their bodies or the objects that they're using in order to see the world from a different perspective. So this might look like, flinging upside down on the monkey bars, or rolling around, or putting things up on a table. And I think back now, and there were no sensory issues or anything else here. And I do wonder whether this boy was practicing over and over the orientation schema. And the reason why is because he would do it with everything. So even outside, he would try to take what he was doing and place it in a higher level or on the side, or try to see things from a different perspective all the time. So that was a really interesting one in hindsight. That I often use in a lot of the conferences and workshops that I do as an example.
I had a bit of an aha moment. Well, I had many actually when I heard you speak at the National Play and Playwork Conference, but one explained a bit more of a reason as to why my child engaged in a certain pattern of behaviour. And that was, she's 9 now, but I think she was about 4 at the time, maybe 5. And she just kept tying cupboards together, or she would tie chairs together, or she would tie something and attach it to the door handle. And to be honest, I cannot remember what schema that fell into, but at the time, hearing you speak, I was like, oh, so it was possibly about more than just her practicing her knots.
Exactly, and it can be a combination of things, and that in particular is the connection schema. And often you'll see children, with the connection schema wanting to connect things up with knots, and also towing them along as well, which can be another part of schema. But the biggest thing for this is that if you are watching children and things like knots take a long time to master. So just the fact that they're wanting to make a connection with toys and bring them together somehow, or objects, if we're constantly cutting off children's play to get to the more important things, which are the important things in our minds, whether it might be to come in and wash our hands, or it's time to do this or time to do that, then the opportunity to play out these schemas and consistently assimilate this information and get it right in children's heads is not provided, and sometimes this can escalate into behaviours that are undesirable. So if you do take or appreciate or want to bring to the forefront of practice schematic pedagogy and a child's right to follow these urges, then we need to give them a lot of time, long periods of uninterrupted play. But this doesn't mean that we don't have a role to play, and this can be quite a controversial issue at the moment in terms of what intentional teaching is. But I believe that people need to be looking at how they position themselves and deciding that when is that right time to come in and really model maybe how to do a knot, so that schema and assimilating that information could be successful. When do I come in with a little bit of help, but when do I fade out and let that happen and play out for the child?
That sounds like the magic question. Is that a question you're still establishing an answer for, Beck, or do you already have a bit of a guide for us as to where that zone is?
Look, I think, watching children is one of the most fascinating things, and often we step back, and Angela Hanscom from Timbernook is a wonderful occupational therapist who I went to see speak, and she said the most powerful words, and I know that if any of my colleagues are listening, they'll laugh because I've just used this so much, but she said that at her place, when the children are, running through the woods, they call it, she tells the staff members to step back but tune in. And I think with our watching in the intentional teaching tool belt, we often forget about the tuning in. We're happy to step back at the moment, I think, but what I'm observing at the moment is that educators are wondering what tuning in looks like. So I suppose I want to remind educators to spend some time using the skill of observing or watching with intent, to better understand what children are trying to make sense of. And when I do workshops on schema, I talk to people about those old-fashioned observations that you can do, such as your running records or even just a mind map of what you think the children might be trying to make sense of, because we use this for our programming and planning, and that is the big question, is what role does the adult play in schema or in a rights-based view. I'm fascinated by the idea of play and play work, and this is why I still have questions I'm not going to say every day, Claire, because it's every night when I go to bed, but this is when the questions come up for me, is when everything's said and done, the dishwasher's packed, and I lie awake at night and I think, some of the play work ideals that have been suggested is that the adult really has less of a role in the play. And I, for the EYLF and for Australian curriculum, I think some educators really struggle with that idea. I'm quite happy to embrace it, but in terms of what we need to be showing through our documentation and identifying the reasoning for this, I would really like to see people practicing that idea of stepping back, but being very attuned by doing some meticulous observation on children's repeated patterns of behaviour, and then having discussions with staff members about fading in with either what is your fade in going to be though? Are you just going to jump in, or are you going to use a prompt with your voice, or are you going to use a prompt with your hands? Are you going to add some resources that you think might really help this along? But how will you do that? Will you dump them, or will you set them up nicely in a provocation? What will be the motivator for the next part of this practice? So as you can see, more questions than answers, Claire.
Yeah, and that's fine. It's actually quite encouraging speaking to someone who's like me. Like I sometimes I question whether I know anything, because I'm so aware of all the things that I don't know. But I think that actually is a quality that people like, because you're not someone that's put yourself on a pedestal that is making out like you've got the answers to everything. And I think there's a danger to that, because those people aren't continuing to try and find answers. They're not doing that reflective thinking that is so very important in order to become the best educator we can be, and in order to give the children that we work with the best start to life that they can have. One thing I do want to touch on, Beck, from what you've just said, is that this theme of stepping back and letting children lead is present in so many of the podcast interviews that I have had. And so it's not necessarily a conversation that you hear typically between educators. It's, as you said, it's not in the curriculum documents that we need to follow and support, but it is this theme which is cropping up in a lot of the people that I'm getting to know and really respect the work of. So I guess at this point in time, educators need to know that there's flexibility in what they do and what they offer that creates space for a bit of that, taking a step back, to not feel like they have to constantly be engaging with children and participating in order to be contributing and to be teaching.
Absolutely. And I wonder whether we're just coming out the other side of a bit of an age of accountability. I don't know if we're coming out the other side of it. Actually, I think it's still existing, but we're starting to question this consistent, what is a teacher? What does a teacher do? If I'm not directly teaching, does that make me a teacher? And, I think we're trying to recover from a bit of an overuse of being accountable all the time, and also it's such a litigious society as well. So we as educators, there's a lot of pressure on people at the moment to show that we're always doing something, and I really think this can be to the detriment of children. But children are children are very good at telling us through their behaviour if something is not working for them. And I suppose the reason why I like to put relationships and reflective practice at the forefront of my engagement with educators is because they already have enough pressure on them to start with in terms of accountability. So if we're constantly telling educators to they should be doing this or they should be doing that, or this is the approach we're taking now, whether it be, nature pedagogy, play work, Reggio Emilia, schematic pedagogy, this or that and the other, I think everybody's on information overload at the moment. And the suggestion that I make to educators is that just look at the children. First and foremost, if you look at the EYLF, every single first sentence of every section of the document talks about relationships and security. So if we're attuned to the children and we're building those relationships, and you go with your instincts and your gut of what that child needs, then I think it's a lot easier to be able to put things like Schema or children's rights at the forefront of your programming, and to be the teacher that you want to be. But it's just it looks different everywhere too, Claire. I go to so many services, and the decisions that people make either to jump in and have a play or not looks very different everywhere I go.
Yeah. And what you shared there, I think, about connection being number one is also exactly what we need to be saying for the parents listening in. Connection is number one, and it doesn't matter how old your children are, but that goes a long way, especially as far as the behaviours that you see, the ones that you love and the ones that you don't appreciate quite so much.
Absolutely. And, the brain research that has been the guiding evidence base for a lot of these documents that we have in early childhood, and even a lot of the decisions we make about the information we give to parents, says that first and foremost, that attachment and that bond needs to be that very first thing that happens before there is success for any type of learning. So not even Schema can happen without that. The children will not test their ideas and not take those risks to do those things unless they feel as though they're secure and supported to do this. And if we're not creating those environments that are conducive to that, then that really does have an effect on the connections that happen in the brain. Connections are constantly happening, and Harvard have just put out a new lot of brain research that says that those connections happen even quicker and more often than what we first thought. So those first 3 years are critical to that.
So our time is almost at an end, Beck, but I think we'll have to have some more conversations, not recording, because I need to pick your brain more. But for everyone else who is listening in, I'd love for you to share where we can find you.
Sure, definitely. Thank you, Claire. It's been wonderful chatting to you. I think you and I could probably talk all day, couldn't we? But I have a website. It's as my learning is. It's always under construction, but it's www.stoneandsprocketec. And it's the word and, stoneandsprocketec.com. Usually most people just come to my Facebook page. And if you do the Facebook, I also have a group of about 400 people in a very supportive space called Inclusion Support. So if you'd like to come and join that group, we talk about lots of these things all the time, and there are some wonderful mentors in the group.
Beautiful. So I'll put a link to all of those things in the show notes.
Wonderful. Thanks, Claire.
Thanks so much, Beck, and thank you for listening in to this episode of the Thriving Children podcast. Until next time, be kind to yourself.
Thanks for listening to the Thriving Children podcast. For even more goodness, visit thrivingchildren.com.au.